We now come to the promised surprise guest part of the program. Some of you may have heard of or from the speaker we're going to be hearing from next. I've talked with him over the years, and I think you'll find him to be a surprisingly effective communicator. He's an officially retired man, but still quite active in public affairs. He spent a lot of time thinking about the issues that have been on the table through our whole first day of Zeitgeist this year, issues of corporate growth, of technological responsibility, of connectedness around the world. And so, ladies and gentlemen of Zeitgeist 2007, I'd like you to turn your attention to the screen because from New York, we have joining us the 42nd President of the United States, William Jefferson Clinton.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, thanks for joining us. Here is the way this will work. We have 2 microphones in the room, and there's a roving microphone who can come to you if you can't get to the microphones. I'm going to ask one question to start this session. President Clinton has said he'd like to take our questions. I'll ask one initial question just to give you time to move to the microphones. From that time onward, I'll just call on you. Here is my initial question for President Clinton. The people in this room have largely built the latest industrial revolution for the United States and for the world. Most of them are not ready to quit their day jobs yet, but many of them are in a position where they know they can leave a mark on the world. There are past models of how people did this well or not so well. The Rockefellers or the Carnegies are one inspiring example. You, President Clinton, have been thinking a lot recently about the right modern models for people to make a mark in the world in a positive way. People in this room are still affecting the world through their work, but they're beginning to think about how they can leave their mark. What would you like them to bear in mind about the conduct of their lives in that regard?
Well, first of all, thank you, Jim, and I want to thank Larry and Sergey and Eric Schmidt, and I think Al Gore's in the audience, and I called him a couple of nights ago and got another updated seminar on climate change, so if I say anything at all about this that you like, I have to give him partial credit, and if I screw it up, I hope you'll correct me after I get off the screen. But let me say, first of all, Bill McDonough gave you a terrific presentation, and I'm very grateful to him for the work he's doing, and particularly in New Orleans, a place where my foundation still works. And I think that taking the work Google does now and the presentation Bill made gives me a chance to ask you to think about how you would spend the rest of your life solving the world's problems or easing the world's ills or giving the next generations a chance to survive climate change or giving poor kids more equal chances in the world. The way I think about it is as follows. Number one, what are the major challenges to the world as we would like it to be? The first is persistent inequality in incomes, education, and health care, and organized systems which enable people to be rewarded for the efforts they exert. And the second is the unsustainability looming over us because of climate change and the related problems of resource depletion and population explosion. Don't forget, even though it's not much discussed, it is projected that the world will grow from its current level of 6.5 billion to 9 billion within only 43 years. It took us 150,000 years, give or take, to grow from 1 to 6.5 billion, and unless we do something quick to put all the girls in the world in school and give all the women in the world equal access to the job market, we're going to have 9 billion people in 43 years, which makes all these problems even more urgent to solve. So the question is, what can you do about it? And is there an inevitable conflict between trying to ease the inequality problems in income, education, and healthcare, particularly in economics, and in trying to do something about climate change, resource depletion, and the aggravation by population explosion? My answer is no, not if we do it right. And if you just look at the previous presentation, the stunning presentation by Mr. McDonough, you see why. Companies may have spent a little more money doing whatever they were doing to save the planet. He explained how, in terms of concrete benefits to employees, they got their investment back. They also created a lot of jobs manufacturing all those products, putting them up, designing them, and imagining the next generation of them. So I think you should ask yourselves 3 questions. if you want to think about how to spend the rest of your life as a citizen and not just as a worker. Number one, am I maximizing my potential and my company's potential to advance the public interest in a cooperative way by what we're doing now and how we're doing it? Number two, what cannot be dealt with that the world faces and my country faces unless there is a significant change in government policy? And how can I best, as a citizen, contribute to bringing about that change? Number three, what is the role of civil society, the non-governmental sector? And what can I do to strengthen it? Google helps me to make the Clinton Global Initiative more effective by making available opportunities for smaller NGOs to reach other people and build collaborations and partnerships around the world. We know that even with optimal government policy and strong, enlightened business leadership, there'll be a gap between where we are and where we ought to be, especially in the developing world, that has to be filled by non-governmental organizations working together with others in the developed world, others in the developing world, with governments. And that's basically what I do. We sell the world's cheapest AIDS medicine and account for about 30% of all those people in the world getting medicine, even though we spend a tiny fraction of what anybody else does. We're working with 40 cities on 5 continents to help them maximize the transition to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in a way that makes their workplaces more productive, their living spaces more habitable, and generates economic growth rather than reduces it. So I think you just need to ask yourself those 3 questions. In the 21st century, we will have to exist as workers, as political actors, and as, I believe, citizen givers. Are you doing all you can at work? What should your politics be, and how can you bring about the changes you want? And in the meanwhile, while we're waiting for all of the political changes we want, what can you do in the non-governmental sector as a citizen servant that will help move things along? I think, we need a major paradigm shift in order to get through this climate change crisis, in order to deal with the rising pressures of population growth and resource depletion, and simultaneously to reduce all these inequalities in the world. And if we don't do it, then the identity conflicts occasioned by our global interdependence, as manifested in roadside bombs set by terrorists, the refusal of the Russians to allow the Kosovars to become independent by UN mandate, the continued conflicts between the Hindu Tamils and the Sinhalese Buddhists in Sri Lanka, and any number of other things. The rise of ideological politics in America and the war on science, which it occasioned, which was the subject of Al Gore's latest book. All these things are going to get worse. If we do it right, they'll all get better. One thing is sure, you've got the right title for this meeting, because there is almost no problem that any individual, any business, or any nation can solve alone.
Okay, well, why don't we go to a question? Yes, sir. Please identify yourself for President Clinton.
President Clinton, Tim Carter from AskTheBuilder.com. About 8 years ago, I got a phone call in my office one day from a gentleman you probably know. He's one of the senators in Arizona. And I helped him save $6,000 by cutting a countertop the right way. And at the end of me helping him, he said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And I said, "To repay you." And I said, "Well, I do have a question." At the time, I was very interested in the flat tax initiative, here in the United States, to try to get some kind of equalization in the taxation. And he said, "Tim, the best way to do that is to get a grassroots movement going, because politicians listen to grassroots movements." So my question to you is, as one of our former presidents, and being so deeply involved in the political process all your life, is can we effectively use a grassroots movement to do some of this work? But more importantly, what is the best way and the shortest pathway that the current politicians will listen to us? Well,
first of all, the answer to your first question is yes. grassroots politics works, and it works for good or ill. For example, in the recent debate on immigration in Washington, I actually supported President Bush's position. At least I supported the position of the administration and most of the Democrats in Congress that there ought to be a path to citizenship for people who are here illegally, as long as they didn't get ahead of those who waited in line legally, so that we could identify everyone that's in our country, acquire better control over our borders. That I thought we ought to lift the quotas for more skilled workers in the short run. I thought that this ought to happen. It was defeated by a grassroots movement of people who basically frightened particularly the Republicans members of Congress in the House and Senate into voting against it. Grassroots movements tend to have more power when there's a lot of emotion in an issue, I suppose, like that. But the reason that grassroots movements are important in terms of building a clean energy future, for example, is that we need more of our members of Congress to know the facts, and then we need more people to make this a voting issue. Many of the things that we need to do as a country today, for example, set a price on carbon, make a commitment to reduce our greenhouse gases significantly, become a part of the international agreement. Or you talked about the flat tax. I'm not so sure about the flat tax because America's so unequal now, but the idea behind the flat tax you see in Europe with the VAT tax, because what they're trying to do there is to, and Al Gore pointed out this to me in our conversation a couple of days ago, they're trying to rely less on employer-specific tax burdens and more on broadly spreading the tax burden so our businesses will be more competitive. In order to get those kinds of changes, people need to, number one, make sure their representatives and senators know what the facts are. Number two, they need to make sure they know they will not be defeated for public office if they support these kinds of changes. Number three, they need to know that it's a voting issue for you. And one of the problems we've got with climate change, for example, right now, is I think there are big majorities in America who would support very significant changes necessary to put America back in the forefront of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and to give us some chance of persuading the Indians, the Chinese, and others to go along with us and to try to save the planet and to do it in an environmentally and economically sensible way. But I'm not sure there are many people in the Congress who believe it's a deep voting issue for people. Only a grassroots movement can change that, barring some natural calamity that everybody will clearly associate with climate change. So I think grassroots movements are important. Now, you're there at the Google meeting that technology gives you a chance to create virtual communities and mass grassroots movements in next to no time. And the interesting thing is it also gives you a chance to do it without having to provoke the kind of hysteria that was provoked in the recent immigration debate, because you have a way to widely disseminate relevant information in a short time. So yes, it's important. Yes, you should do it. And it's being done as never before. But in the big critical issues to our survival, number one, people have to have the facts in Washington. Number two, they have to know that they will be supported. And number three, they have to know not only that they won't be defeated if they take action, but they might be in trouble if they don't, because it is a voting issue for the American people, whether it's tax reform or reducing greenhouse gases.
We know that you there were certain things you wanted to be sure everybody in this audience had heard, even if we didn't happen to ask them in questions. So is there any other particular message that has not come up in a question you want to be sure we hear before we go to further questions?
No, I'd rather talk about whatever the audience wants to talk about. I just want to say that, again, you cannot afford to be satisfied with your life in the 21st century in a wealthy country at the cusp of technological change only in your work life. You've got to be a political citizen and care about what government has to do, both your national government, your local government, and international cooperation. And beyond that, you need to be involved in some sort of non-governmental work, because there's a big gap between where we are and where we ought to be, and it's not going to be filled tomorrow just by the marketplace and government. Civil society is needed there. it's exploding. We've got twice as many foundations in America as we had at the beginning of the decade. So there are more and more people involved in this, but because of technology, we can have an exponentially larger positive impact, not as a substitute for proper government action or a substitute for responsible business action, but a supplement to it. It's basically your citizenship will have to unfold in three parts in the 21st century.
Thank you. Yes, over here. Yes.
Boss, this is Chris Edley asking your question. Respectfully. There's one problem.
That means it won't be.
No. There's one problem, which is engineering the right kind of interventions, both public and private sector interventions, to do something about global poverty and similar challenges. But the other question is, the parallel challenge is building enough of a sense of connection between people who view themselves as different so that you can have a moral consensus to actually take action. So, and I know you share that view. So my question is, what are some of the most exciting or effective strategies that you've experienced that help build that sense of connection?
Well, I think that, let me just give you one example. I think that one of the most interesting ones is a little website called kiva.org, which allows individuals of very modest means to become directly involved in extending microcredit to people in Africa, Central Asia, Latin America, all kinds of developing countries, by actually selecting projects, contributing to them, knowing that a local non-governmental organization is managing this, getting reports on it, and then becoming ongoing with their involvement. Kiva has all kinds of business people who need credit all over the world. And after I talked about them and they were featured on Oprah Winfrey's show when my book came out, for the first time in their brief history, they had no more customers and they had more credit than they knew what to do with. So I think we've only scratched the surface of having people see that people in other countries with different skin colors and different perspectives and different faiths actually have a lot in common with them. Now, there are lots of other strategies that I think have to be pursued, but to go back to your point, if you really think about the source of most of the world's problems, they're rooted in the conviction that cooperation is not as important a value as conflict because our differences are more important than our common humanity. So my general answer to you is anything that brings people in positive contact with one another and reaffirms their common humanity is a good thing. I have long supported an organization called Seeds of Peace in the Middle East that began as a partnership between Palestinian Muslim kids and Jewish Israeli kids and some Arab Israeli kids, and now encompasses people throughout the Middle East. Now they're trying to do it in the Balkans, in Northern Ireland and other places. I think that we have to find a way for people to have consistent, constructive contact with each other when they're young to affect the way people think about their differences. I think that we have to find a way for people to appreciate what's unique about themselves without being drunk about it in their arrogance. That is, to think that, God ordained all of us with Ivy League educations like you and me to occupy the superior positions we do, or in a total other context that Allah really does want the Al-Qaeda to send all those young kids to an early death so they can immediately go to heaven and get a medal pinned on for killing a lot of other non-combatants. All of these things are basically heresies of arrogance, the idea that our differences matter more than what we have in common. In a way, that's also keeping us from making the right decisions on climate change. If we really believed that our common humanity was more important than our interesting differences, we could not live with ourselves if we ran any risk that was avoidable that our children and grandchildren wouldn't have the same or better life chances than we have. Almost every one of the world's problems requires a cooperative solution and requires people to give up the notion that their identity requires them to have somebody to look down on just because of the categories in which they find themselves. And I think we've got a big job to do in teaching and arguing about that, and also giving young people contradictory experiences. If you look at, it's not enough just to live together. I mean, look at what the big problem with the British, for example. At least in 9/11, Americans could say, oh, well, we were invaded. And the whole world, briefly, before we diverted to Iraq, was supporting the United States. Because, among other things, we had 200 plus Muslims killed, innocent Muslims killed in the United States. Had 230-something British citizens, people from all over the world, from 70 countries, by an invading force. Look what happened in Britain in the bus bombings and the subway bombings. You had British citizens affecting that. What happened? These people didn't think they belonged. Their whole reality was different from those with whom they worked. Their kids went to school, their kids played, they went to sporting events and movies together. They were not there. Look at the recent car bombings, which thank God failed in the UK, where you had 2 doctors who would have killed, had they succeeded, more people on one day than the number of lives they saved in their entire careers. That was a humongous identity crisis. And so I think that that's sort of the next... an old civil rights expert like you, we need to think about going beyond the notion of civil rights to civil community. You know what the major debate in biology is today? This is interesting. When and Al and I, in our last year in the White House, there's an international consortium of scientists finally finished sequencing the human genome. And as a layperson, to me, the most important finding was that we were all genetically 99.9% the same. So that if you look around that room today, every difference you can see among people, including gender and race, is rooted in 0.1% of our genetic makeup. Now, Craig Venter, who was one of the competitors and who then became a cooperator with the International Consortium to sequence the genome, has done a lot of work since then, and he has come up with new findings that say that that's wrong, that we are in fact 99.5% the same, not 99.9%. This does have huge implications for scientific research, whether our differences are in half of 1% of our genetic makeup or a tenth of 1%. But for politics, it is a stunning reaffirmation that it is nuts for us to go around killing each other and killing off our children's future and thinking that our differences are all that matter, since the whole range of them is somewhere between 1/10 and 1/2% of our biological makeup. And I think somehow we have to get that across. That has to infuse the way we teach our children about our religious faith, about their family and community obligations, about how they imagine themselves going up and having meaning in their lives.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, over here.
Good evening, Mr. President. My name is Jim Colaturis. I am a Googler, and a quick question for you relating to, I think what a lot of these global attendees would ask with regard to the biggest issues they face domestically, which are potentially energy, healthcare, and education. I guess the first question would be, are we looking at these issues incorrectly by qualifying them specifically as domestic? And 2, are these 3 issues in particular too big for any one governmental branch or even a government to handle on its own without looking internationally for a solution?
Let's take them each in turn, shall we? The answer to the energy question is that we clearly can't do what we need to do about climate change or global resource depletion alone. On the other hand, that argument has been used by people who didn't really want us to do anything. When Al Gore went to Kyoto to finish the negotiations there, the U.S. Senate voted against the Kyoto Treaty, and then I think almost before Al got off the plane. I know it was the only bill I ever lost in the Congress before I ever sent it to them. And then when President Bush got elected, he just withdrew from it. And one of the big arguments was, well, we can't solve this alone because India and China and the other developing nations have to be part of it. Well, it's true that we can't do it, but it's also true that as the richest of the countries and the biggest greenhouse gas emitter, we will never get them to be a part of it unless we strike out alone and do as much as we can by setting a ceiling on carbon, pricing carbon, making a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and proving that the Bill McDonoughs of the world make it possible for us to make this good economics, not bad economics. And if I had more time, I could give you another 30 examples of things we could do that would spark an enormous economic boom in this country if we did it right. So I think that we are making a terrible mistake by thinking that because we can't whip the climate change problem without international cooperation, we don't really need to do much between now and then. I think every day we lose is a tragic day, moving us closer to biofeedback in a climate situation and giving up opportunities we have to create new businesses, new jobs, and greater democracy and economic opportunity within the United States, and setting an example that others would then be more likely to follow, increasing the chances that we can get a new international climate agreement. So that's what I think about that. On health care, that really is something we can deal with on our own for Americans. We have three huge problems. We spend $700 billion more than we would spend if we had any other country's health system. And a lot of them have better health outcomes than we do. We insure 16% fewer of our people than we would insure if we had any other advanced country's health system. And the third problem is we do a good job of treating people when they're really, really sick and a bad job of keeping more of them well and healthy in the first place. That has led us to the verge of an epidemic in childhood obesity and alarming rates of type 2 diabetes in young people, which will collapse our healthcare system within a decade, even if we reorganize it so that we save money and have universal coverage. We just need to take the best lessons we've learned from the American systems, from what works here and from other countries, and deal with this in a way that is good for healthcare and good for the economy. And we have a consensus to do it now. Globally, we cannot achieve a healthy planet unless we contribute more money to, among other things, AIDS, TB, and malaria, and infections related to dirty water, cholera, dysentery, diarrhea. Those things claim 25% of all the lives on Earth. And we need to invest more in public health, waste management. 1 billion people have no access to clean water, 2.6 billion people no access to sanitation. There are lots of problems that have to be handled globally. They're much, much cheaper than going to war, I might add. It wouldn't cost us very much money to do this. I could give you the annual cost of all these things for us to pay our fair share, and they would all be a pittance of what we spend in Iraq. Now, on education, I think there's a national issue and an international issue. We have the best system of higher education in the world still in terms of the number of quality institutions, although we're not winning many international competitions anymore, like the International Computing Competition that occurs every year among global universities. I think we need to do more to make college universally available. We need to do more to give at least 2 years of post-high school education and training to people who don't go. We need to loosen the rules again to let more foreign students come here to study if they want, not just to get H-1B visas, but to study. In other words, we need to keep our competitive advantage. We need to invest more in research of all kinds through the university networks and the national institutes. But pre-high school, we have a different problem, which is that a lot of our schools are doing a good job, but the system as it works never replicates excellence very well, because it's neither a top-down system nor a bottom-up, fully competitive system. And we know what works. And I don't think leave no child behind is the best way to do this. I think there are too many tests that are too meaningless. I think that we know that high levels of performance come largely from school cultures that have defined goals where there is a general assumption that all children can learn, and then appropriate supports to maximize the chances that they do, get parents into the school system, make the benefits of the school system available to parents whose first language is not English. There are lots of things that can be done, and we have huge numbers of examples, but we do not replicate excellence. That needs to be done in America. Then there is an international agenda. 130 million kids don't go to school. Tens of millions more go to school without learning materials and basic texts. So it's cheap to put them all in school. We spent just $300 million in my last year as president to give kids in the developing world one good meal if they'd come to school to get it. Just $300 million. Enrollment went up 6 million. That's $50 a kid a year. So we spent $2.5 billion a week in Iraq. So that's about a day, less than a day. So should we spend more money to put all the world's children in school? Yes. Should we spend more for learning materials? Yes. Could technology make a difference? You know, if you had the right access to the internet and a printer and a solar powered printer in the most remote villages in the world, you wouldn't need textbooks anymore. And there are lots of things you guys can do about this that ought to be thought through. There's John Wood, a former Microsoft executive, has done a lot of work on this. Greg Mortensen with the Central Asia Institute has done a lot of work on this. How do you bring educational materials and meaningful education to people in poor parts of the world? But the rest of the world, in a developing country, every year of schooling adds 10% to income per year for life on average. So we have work to do in America and work to do in the world. And again, it's a lot cheaper than going to war, and we should do it. We can never overcome all this inequality unless we build systems of education and health care around the world. But again, we need international money, but NGOs can have a big role here. This is what I do. We sell AIDS medicine in 71 countries. It's the least expensive, high-quality AIDS medicine in the world, and try to put up health systems in 25 of those. And, you know, every day we see that intelligence and creativity and willingness to work hard is evenly distributed throughout the world. What is not evenly distributed is investment, education, organization, systems. That's what we need to think about. And I don't mean systems in a bureaucratic way. I mean systems like the systems that all of you access. If you sit down in front of a computer and you Google somebody, you think there is a connection between the keys you push and the information you get back. The fundamental problem in really poor places is that there are almost no systems where, no matter how smart people are, there is a predictable consequence to the effort they make. So that's what we have to do in education, that's what we have to do in healthcare, that's what we have to do in economic empowerment in those countries.
Thank you. We have just about 9 minutes left with the President. How about a question here?
Okay, hi, President Clinton. Jim Steyer from Common Sense Media. We've been talking a lot today about the environment, world poverty, a lot of really key global issues. But we are at Google in the center of the technology universe. And I wanted to ask you how you think companies like Google and the other major media and technology companies here have done in terms of looking at the impact of media and technology here in the U.S. and around the globe, and what they ought to be doing about that, and also what the role is of the private sector versus the public sector in looking, again, at media and technology's impact on the world and also kids in particular, as you know. Thanks.
Well, you can answer that question a lot better than I can, and you already have in your career. And I thank you for it. I think, let me just make a couple of observations which may seem superficial compared to the work that you've done, but I think in terms of the media, the news media, and the way people communicate information, I think we are going through a period of transformation that started probably before we took office back in '93 and is not yet finished. I was thinking about the difference in the coverage of the Iraq War and the coverage of the Vietnam War and the coverage of World War II. But when I was a young man and Vietnam was raging, we had 3 television networks, and they had enough competition to keep each other honest and enough guaranteed market share to send seasoned reporters in their 50s to be on site for an extended period of time and say what they thought and write. And the newspapers, every city had at least 1 daily, and you could afford to have 2 daily papers. It was a much more orderly process. Then it all got blurred with cable and satellite television and the entertainment networks, and you don't have to watch the news at all anymore. And your friend, my daughter, tells me that as many of her generation get their news from the Jon Stewart's Comedy Hour as they do from network news. Increasing numbers of young people don't read newspapers at all, but they do read the newspapers' websites. So, look at what Al Gore's done with his television network. So what I think is happening is we're going through a period where we're moving toward more and more discrete sources of news, where if you're willing to exert the effort, you can use technology to have access to the same sort of in-depth information, maybe even more, than you used to be able to find in the narrow channels of the 60s. And I think that the period we had where the news could be politicized, or in effect where the compulsions on people producing it, because the competition was so stiff, to turn 3-dimensional people and issues into 2-dimensional cartoons, something that Vice President Gore and I both have a little experience with, that is going to abate. And I think that over the long run, the democratization of disseminating information and opinion will give us a more literate citizenry if we have an absolute principle of universal access to technology, including training and how to use it, how to make it affordable and how to use it. We did a lot of work in the administration in trying to make sure all the schools and hospitals and rural libraries were connected, and we had an E-rate which saved the schools $2 billion a year in charges they otherwise would have had to pay. I'm a little out of the loop now, but somebody needs to do an update on that. How are we doing in community learning centers? How many schools are open at night? How universal is access to the latest technology? And how much do people know about what they can find? But I like the direction of this. I find myself now, for example, every day when I read my news clips, I also read many as a dozen different blog sites, because I know that these are the people that may only have to write 1 article a day. And so I like the direction this is going in. I'm still concerned that not everybody is going to be able to go. And so I think we need a lot of focus on access.
President Clinton, there are many, many more people here who would like to ask you questions. Our time with you has come to an end. If you had a microphone in the whole audience, you would have heard applause and laughter at all the appropriate places. So we're very, very grateful for your spending this time with us. Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you all very much. Thanks for having me.